Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We just have, again, about 10 minutes till we start the lecture and comments on our essay topic today. So, anyway, good to see you guys that are here. Justin, Jemin, Santino, welcome back. And we're just going to wait a little bit until 4 p.m. So, 10 minutes or so, and then we'll get going. One second, I'm going to get myself a little sparkling water. I'm still on it. Hey, Korea, Jennifer, welcome back, guys. Good to see you both. Mary Jane, welcome. Good to see you too. Eddie. Huh? It's all good. Eddie down here. Huh? Yeah. Come on here. No. Coming up? No. Being shy. Come on. Oh yeah. Okay, there he goes. Come on in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he talks a lot actually. He's always saying stuff. So he's got a lot on his mind. Don't you, Ed? Hey, Eddie. Yeah, his sister's a little more quiet than him, but yeah, he's just always trying to verbalize something. Good, Eddie. Hmm? Yeah. Okay, Ed. Hey, Leanne. Good afternoon, Jasmine. Welcome back to you. He's like rubbing around all the different surfaces and objects here. He's purring a lot right now. He's pretty happy. So that's cool. Hey, Eddie. Mhm. Big boy. Yeah. Still have, yeah, about 5 or so, a little more than 5 minutes till we start. How's it going, Eddie? Yeah, yeah. Welcome back, Violet. Good to see you. Elena, good to see you. Hi. Hey, Carson. Okay, another 4 minutes. Hey, Giannis. Anthony, welcome back. Good to see you too. Nick, hello. Hey there. A couple minutes to go, and then we'll get started. Eddie? Hey, Sandra. Hey, JJ. What do you say, Eddie? I have to use a keyboard. I'll put you up here, okay? Go ahead. Good boy. Come on. Hey, Rosemary. And Jasmine McMahon, welcome back. He's such a silly kitty. He's always doing random stuff. It's super cute, though. Hey, Julian, good to see you there. Hey, Tyler. Hey, what's up? All right, come on in. Not to worry, Jemin. probably almost done with your day, so just get through this. Welcome, Michelle, and everybody else that's already, said hello. It's good to see everybody here today. Now that we're at 4 o'clock, let's get things started. Eddie, let's give you some different space. How do you go over there? Welcome back, guys. Okay, so let me just take us back into our notes and topic. As you know, we've made progress from a couple things that we started the class with. We started talking about ethical theory, Kant and Mill, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. Then we moved on to the abortion debate, and we studied both pro-choice and pro-life authors. And then, as of last time, we started making headway into this new segment of the class, which deals with moral debates concerning drug policy, recreational drug use, prohibition, legalization, and things like that. So on Thursday last week, by the way, I hope everybody had a great weekend and that you're having a good start this week. We just went over a bunch of empirical data, stats, and figures about like drug usage rates in the United States and elsewhere. We talked about like the prevalence of drug use among people in our country over the age of 12, the rate of alcohol use, tobacco use. We gave definition for drug. We talked about most people, when they talk about drug use in the morally controversial sense, are not just referring to any type of drug use, but rather non-medical psychotropic drug use. We talked about the definitions or concepts of drug abuse, drug dependence, and the moral questions that we want to debate and that we're focused on are like, is non-medical recreational drug use morally permissible? Is government prohibition of non-medical recreational drug use morally permissible or not? We talked about the distinctions between the topic of like decriminalization, criminalization, and legalization. And then we talked about 3 different principles of criminalization: the harm principle, the paternalism principle, and the legal moralism principle, each one offering a slightly different answer as to what would justifiably make it permissible to criminalize something. On the harm principle, the only justified basis to make something a crime is in case it would harm other people besides the person doing the action. On the paternalism principle, it doesn't require harm to a third party to justify making something criminal, but merely just that it could harm the individual themselves who is doing it. And then there's the legal moralism principle, which says that even absent harm, if some conduct could be arguably defined as immoral, then that would be enough of a basis to make it criminalized. And of course, debates around drug policy often have to do with the paternalism principle, which says that it's fair and reasonable for the state to criminalize conduct, even if it doesn't affect other people, as long as it is harmful to the one that's doing it. We also talked about how paternalism in general is this idea of restricting someone's liberty for the sake of their own best interests. Parents do this to children. In fact, the Latin root of the word paternalism has the word father built into it, because it calls to mind the idea of parents who sometimes will curtail or limit the autonomy of children in order to prevent them from doing harm to themselves while they're still developing and maybe not fully rational yet. James Q. Wilson is the first author on this topic that we started discussing on Thursday. And we just have some notes to finish off his paper. There's not a lot left, but there's just a few points remaining. James Q. Wilson wrote the paper known as, in our textbook, getting back to that again, against the legalization of drugs. And he was one of the important founders or architects of anti-drug policy and the zero tolerance kind of anti-drug laws in the United States. The whole war on drugs and the whole concept of that, in part, he was spearheading that effort because he was the chairman of the National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse Prevention, which was formed by Richard Nixon back in the early 70s. And he's writing this paper in the year 1990, looking back on his policy choices and basically taking a victory lap, saying that it was a good thing that they kept these zero tolerance drug laws instead of going the route of perhaps maybe more lenient laws or even legalizing certain drugs. His intellectual opponent in the whole debate would have been Milton Friedman, a libertarian economist, who said that we should grant people maximum individual liberty as long as what they're doing doesn't affect others. So he thought drugs should have been legalized. But Wilson basically says we didn't take his advice, and he thinks that's good for a few reasons. And by the way, to those that have entered the chat, welcome everyone, whether it's Michelle, Natalie, Juliet, or Jason. Good to see you guys as always. So I'm just going through some of the summary of last time. We haven't gotten anything new quite yet. But when he wrote this paper in 1990, he says that the total number of basic heroin addicts in the country was around the same number as it had been in the late 70s. And he thinks that that's good because it shows that there was no increase in use even as the population increased, which means that he thinks his policies were in part responsible for averting broader accessibility and appeal of these type of narcotic drugs to the general population. He points out another statistic that the average age of a emergency room admitted heroin user had grown from 27 in 1976 to around 32 in 1986. He takes this as evidence that it's losing appeal to young people, and part of the reason for that is that they fear problems with the law if they were to violate anti-drug laws, and that they also observe the ill health effects of their elders through the use of those drugs. He thinks that it's not just treatment that explained the drop in users, because that wouldn't explain the drop in new users and the decreasing, or I should say, the increasing age of the average user. He says, what if we had taken Milton Friedman's advice and gone the route of kind of more libertarian-minded legalization? He thinks we would have put people in a much different position than the one that they were put in. That drugs like, for example, heroin that he talks about a lot would have been legal, would have been cheap, would have had high quality assured. Even if usage would have been safer, there would have been fewer barriers to access, because when something's legalized, the price becomes more affordable and it becomes more accessible to more people. So he thinks in terms of like economic common sense, something that's criminalized is going to just stand in the way of people's efforts to get it. It'll make it harder to access, it'll make the supply less abundant, and it'll, of course, increase prices because there's no price controls when it's sold on the black market. I think when we finished last time, we were getting to this discussion that Friedman and him were having about, Friedman had this view that when you criminalize the drugs, you may actually provide an additional incentive to people to use it, because now it constitutes a sort of forbidden fruit since there's illegality surrounding it. And maybe that has some kind of tantalizing appeal to people who otherwise might not have been that interested in it if not for the fact that it was illegal. But he doesn't agree with that. He thinks that once again, whatever sort of additional appeal that some substance may have on the basis that it's illegal is going to be outweighed by the fact that it's also now more expensive and harder to find. And Wilson, also thinks that it's not people that push drugs, as these black market dealers that create addicts, but it's just widespread access to it and affordability. Now, he cites another piece of evidence. In the 1960s, the UK, Britain, they had a pilot program that they, tried to institute, which basically allowed some limited access to the controlled substance of heroin for people that were severely addicted, so that they could gain access to it in sort of a clinical setting without having fear of having it confiscated or having fear of being, apprehended by the police. So there was this kind of limited program in the 1960s that experimented with the idea of like, what if we allowed some of these heroin addicts to have actual legal access to that drug? But he thinks that the experiment didn't work out as people might have hoped, because in the end it led to overprescribing of the drug and an increase in overall youth usage rates. And the number of heroin addicts, he argues, increased by at least fivefold. Part of the reason for that is that people who were in the system that were patients, quote unquote, could always say that they needed more than was actually true, and then sell off whatever surplus amounts they had to new users, and therefore recruiting new users into the ranks of the addicted. He gives the statistic that there was an increase in known addicts from about 68 at the beginning of the 1960s to around 2,000 by the year 1968. I'm not sure where he derives this statistic from. I would think perhaps that, it's hard to collect accurate statistics on the number of addicts that there are in a whole country, but at least with that statistic, he again says that when legalization happened, it didn't actually result in fewer people using it or people using it in rate or younger people losing interest in it. Rather, it resulted in an increase. In the 1980s, the trend continued, and again, he thinks the problem was an overabundant supply. So he says that if we in America had adopted a similar policy of legalization or tacit legalization, then we would have had similar bad results, except with a much larger population size. And so we would have consigned a lot more people to addiction and all the other ill effects that come from that. In 1990, when he's writing this, he speaks about how cocaine and crack were more the focus of anti-drug efforts than heroin had been, say, in like the 70s and in some part of the 80s. And as was the case when he was the chairman of the National Advisory Drug Abuse Prevention Council, some people advised criminalization to reduce usage and addiction, and other people advocated, legalization. And he says, again, that the same increased usage phenomena would have also had attended decriminalization of crack and cocaine if those things had been legalized. Now, one thing I got to say about Wilson's whole article is that he sets himself an easy target, because what he talks about a lot in this article are not just every drug that's criminalized. He talks about the most dangerous drugs possible, so he specifies that heroin has high addictive potential and it leads people into a lifestyle where it makes them counterproductive or they drop out of being a functional member of society. And then he talks about crack in the same way, that crack can make people volatile, impulsive, prone to violent behavior. So it doesn't make them harmless individuals when they use crack, and therefore they're actually a threat to other people. He also mentions that women who are pregnant that use crack will have the so-called crack babies, and that, of course, can result in birth defects and other kind of ill health outcomes for the child. And so for these reasons, he thinks that with attention to like crack and heroin, that they're not just victimless crimes. This is why he thinks that he can actually make an argument for anti-drug policies based on the harm principle of criminalization. But what I was trying to say is that if he singles out the most dangerous drugs that exist, the narcotic drugs, heroin and cocaine, it's pretty easy for him to say that those are bad for you, that they're addictive, and that they can cause harm, both to your health and maybe to the resulting behavior that you then engage in for other people. But it's not like he's talking about every drug under the sun. So, I mean, he'd have a harder time, I think, making the same kind of harm argument with like marijuana or certain like hallucinogens, which don't necessarily render the user violent, chaotic, or impulsive, but in some cases have a more mild effect, or one that at least doesn't render them incapable of, continuing on with their good function in society. So I'm presenting his paper, but I have my own thoughts on it as we talk about it. One of the things I think is that he kind of singles out some of the harshest drugs, and that makes his case easier to make. But if he's really making a wholesale argument that drugs should be criminalized across the board, then I would have thought he probably shouldn't just only specify the ones that, probably all sides can shake hands and agree that heroin and cocaine and crack are, dangerous substances that can produce harm of those kinds. But when we talk about drug debates, about drug policy, it's not only those drugs that people are worried about the effects of criminalization. Anyway, I continue. As I was saying, he appeals to the harm argument. He thinks that the use of, say, heroin, cocaine, and crack is not just something that harms the one user, but they can have these spillover effects to harm other members of society. So in that case, he thinks society has a compelling interest in ensuring that we don't become drug addicts. Now, he says there is some speculation about what would be the effect of full-scale legalization, and we can't know exactly how legalization would impact usage rates unless we were to fully legalize all these drugs. But he says that if we were to find out what the result would be, that would require a sort of dangerous social experiment which couldn't easily be undone if it had negative effects. So a couple more sections, he asks the question in the next section, have we lost? And what he means by that is like, have we lost the war on drugs? Some say that we should legalize drugs because we have lost the war. And the greater harm, even greater harm than drug use, is the continuing negative effects of the war on drugs itself. The author that we're going to get into once I wrap up these last few remarks about Wilson, he's definitely going to press that case. He's going to say that if you're to look at the total harms produced by drug use as opposed to the actual harms imposed by the legal system on people from illegality, that it's greater on the side of the harms that are caused by criminalization than even drug use itself. But Wilson doesn't agree with that. And he again repeats that people were saying this to him in 1972 about heroin, but he says by not surrendering to their viewpoint, we were able to, in his view at least, minimize the total number of victims and limit the spread of addiction to a greater number of people. And hi, Miana, Jason, and the others. Not to worry if you're a few minutes late. It's good to have you here now. Now, have we spent too much money on the war on drugs that's not being compensated for by social benefits that we get from those expenses? The total cost in dollars in 1990, when he wrote this, was about $13 billion a year to enforce laws against drugs. So here, let me put that in the chat. So I just put there the cost of the laws against drugs, like so enforcement efforts, incarceration of people, providing them with court-appointed attorney if they couldn't possibly, afford it on their own, would be around a $13 billion figure. And I see you, Tyler, mentioning that it's like an epic fail. Maybe what you mean by that is that that's a lot of money to spend on these efforts. And he concedes the point that it is quite a big amount of money, but he says we're getting something for the cost. He thinks that what would be the alternative? If we were to legalize the drugs, then we wouldn't be spending, by definition, money on enforcing laws that don't exist. So we'd save the 13 billion, I guess. But he thinks that that would be overcompensated for by other social costs. For example, the increased rate of crime that would happen when people had greater access to drugs would be something that would have some financial impacts. And he also thinks that people dropping out of the workforce, becoming destitute, and needing, say, like welfare payments in order to support themselves or their families, that would also require additional costs. So he thinks that you think you're saving money on non-enforcement of the laws if they were repealed, but now you have to pay additional money on the other end for these kind of things that are somewhat mitigated by the existence of the laws. You talk about how the DARE program was also a fail, and there is some statistical evidence to show that. I've read research that shows that people that went through the DARE program, there was no significant decrease in overall drug usage rates, and even in some circles, it was argued that there could have been a mild increase. So, what we're getting back for the money that we spend on anti-drug education, laws against drugs, incarceration efforts, and housing of inmates and everything else, that it's a bit questionable. But he makes his case. He makes his case that you have to consider both alternatives. In one alternative, the actual world, we're spending a lot of money on the anti-drug laws and enforcement efforts, but we're maybe not spending as much on the crime that would be associated with greater drug usage rates and the welfare payments, in his view anyway, that would attend more people using those same drugs. Now, here's another option that some people throw out there, and he talks about it. Some people say that if you want to make sure that we don't lose money as a society when we legalize drugs, if we did, that there's one way that we can make sure that we get enough revenue from the drug users to pay for whatever social costs the rest of us bear. And what do you think that suggestion could be, policy-wise or economically? How could we make sure that if we were to legalize the drugs, that we would be able to generate enough revenue to overcompensate whatever financial losses we had from either crime or welfare payments? We would simply have to do what, perhaps, with the pricing? Anyone have a thought on this? If you could add that to the chat, because this is his next point of discussion. Tax the product, right? Tax it more heavily. Exactly. Drug taxes. So think about that. What if we were to just impose high tax rates? Then that gets paid for by the people buying the drugs, and the taxation that is collected from the public that's using it could then be used to kind of help, compensate for or withstand some of the other social costs financially that we would then have. He understands people make this argument, but he says in his response that we couldn't simply fix the budget issue by collecting taxes from the sale of the drugs at a higher rate, because then we'd be back to another problem. Once you're taxing these drugs at a higher rate, they become less affordable for people, and then it would be greater the likelihood that they would commit crimes in order to pay for them, which again would result in some kind of financial harm. So he says, pick your poison. If you legalize drugs, there's going to be more people committing crimes. If you want to try and pay for that by taxing the drugs more, now it's harder for them to afford them, so they're even likelier to, engage in all kinds of mischief in order to secure the necessary funds to purchase the drugs that are taxed at these higher rates. So in his mind, anyway, the simplest and best solution is to simply have these strict anti-drug laws that will impose penalties on people should they use them. Does that cost money? He admits, of course, that it does, but he thinks that there's no simple solution that would be more cost-effective as an alternative. At least this is his argument. Yeah. After that, he talks about benefits of illegality, and so he thinks he's going to next describe what are certain things that are benefits we gain from having the anti-drug laws and the status quo that we're looking at right now. So what are some of the benefits of illegality? I'll talk to you about some of the things he mentions. So one thing he says is that when drugs are illegal, people can be compelled by court order into treatment. So okay, so there's one benefit that he mentions that I put in the chat. He says when the drugs are illegal, here's something that happens sometimes. So say that a person, they they were caught either selling or possessing or using some kind of controlled substance, which the law defines as a crime. And then they go to court, and their case is adjudicated. So now there's some kind of sentencing decision. In some cases, what the judge will offer to the person is that if they participate and successfully complete some kind of what do they call them, diversion program, like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, or some other kind of treatment program, right? If they can return back with a certificate of completion to the court, then that will allow them to have the record expunged or have the case annulled, right? And so that gives people an incentive who've been caught up in the gears of the legal system through a drug offense to, comply with the order if they don't want a bigger problem legally or whatever. And so imagine that drugs were made legal. We wouldn't be able to urge people by court compulsion to go into these programs because they wouldn't be committing a crime in the first place. By definition, if there's no crime, then there's never a judge that sees the person and has the ability to exert this leverage over them. So he says, to whatever extent putting people into treatment centers is a good thing for these addicted people, one benefit of illegality is that there's going to be some role for the courts to play to try and, coerce people a little bit into doing that. He also says another benefit of illegality is that it makes anti-drug education efforts more effective. I'm not sure if that's totally true, but he makes the case for that. So here's another point he raises. Anti-drug education efforts be more effective. So what he means by that is when we have a legal system that tells you that you could be in trouble with the law for using these drugs or possessing them or whatever, and then we have anti-drug education efforts, like someone mentioned the DARE program, or sometimes you'll see like commercials on TV that say, there used to be the old Just Say No campaign in the 80s and others, that you've probably seen or at least heard about in your life. He says that the effect of the anti-drug messaging or programs in society is kind of made less effective when it's not backed by the threat of legal punishments. So, like, take, for example, what we might say to young people that are considering drinking alcohol. We can, and in some cases we do have like advertisements and so forth that, even anti-cigarette ad campaigns, like Truth was one that I saw in the 2000s or whatever. And they would run commercials where they would show people all the harms of smoking. There used to be this classic commercial that showed like a lady smoking through her neck because she had to have a tracheotomy due to like loss of lung function. I remember a classic commercial, anti-drug commercial that showed, an egg, and then it's like, this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs. And then they just let the egg scramble in a frying pan, So anyway, take the net effect of all these anti-drug education efforts and programs and messages. What he says is they really wouldn't be as effective or powerful if people knew that despite the message they're hearing, they still, literally could purchase the drug. With alcohol, for example, knowing that it's legal, even if you hear a really good argument or you see a really good piece put on media somewhere that tells you how bad it is and how you should really not do it, it might not necessarily weigh on you that heavily when you know that it's illegal. So he thinks that anti-drug education efforts are more effective when the drugs are criminalized. But again, I don't know if he's appealing to just intuition and common sense. I'm not sure the statistics necessarily bear that out when you actually look at drug usage rates in comparison to people who, like, say, went through the DARE program, as some had mentioned earlier. But anyway, he makes that case. He also says briefly, kind of without much argument at all, that there's something immoral about drug use generally, even if it didn't have any other ill health effects or negative harmful effects. So he says it also kind of reflects our moral values as a society to somehow stand up these anti-drug laws. Now, there's an obvious issue that he has to contend with, which he talks about towards the end of his paper, and that's what he calls the alcohol problem. Let me see if anyone thinks they could figure this out. What kind of inconsistency or contradiction could you imagine in his position about anti-drug laws, given the fact that alcohol is a thing in our society? You might say, what's the hypocritical or perhaps inconsistent point to urge so forcefully for anti-drug laws, criminalization, and so on? That could perhaps be seen as somewhat contradictory to the basic fact that what? He's telling us that the drugs should all be illegal, and he stands on that. But how does that in some way conflict with the policies and views that we have when it comes to alcohol. Anybody have a thought? Let's see if you get that in the chat, and then we can move on to the next little piece of my explanation here. But yeah, in connection with this whole anti-drug discussion, someone might argue that, okay, alcohol is not typically associated with the hard drugs. That's right. But a person who says that these drugs are so harmful, they impose so much harm on society, they can harm you, they can harm people around you. You can become addicted, you can become destitute, derelict, you can no longer maybe keep your job, raise your family, complete school, maybe you'll commit crimes because you're so into the drug to support the habit. If someone's going to say all those things about drugs, right, how can they turn a blind eye to the fact that alcohol is legal and it has addictive potential and it can also produce all these ill health effects and terrible bad behavior? People can get blackout drunk and cause chaos, act in a way that's violent, not even remember what they did. So exactly, Marina. Alcohol could be seen as dangerous, but it's legal. I mean, I don't know. Both of you guys are saying that it's not associated with hard drugs, or it's not seen as dangerous. But I'm not sure that's quite the point that he's making. I mean, what he's trying to say is that a reasonable person could argue that it is quite dangerous. So we're being inconsistent. How can we have these heavy-handed anti-drug laws, right? But we all tolerate legally consumption of alcohol for people above a certain age. And so, that's a point that a critic could make. Like, how can you, James Wilson, argue in favor of criminalization full scale when it comes to any of these other drugs, but you're kind of not really making that argument when it comes to alcohol? To be consistent, shouldn't you say that since alcohol is legal and it has all these negative effects, that the legalization of drugs would be just on par with that? So again, to repeat the point, an obvious question for Wilson is, why should we treat heroin and cocaine differently from alcohol? We have legal access to alcohol, so why should we be treating these other drugs differently? What's the reason for the different status? And what he says in reaction to that is he kind of concedes one point. He says, yes, alcohol is a drug. It does have psychotropic effects, mind-altering, consciousness-altering effects, behavioral-altering effects. And yes, it has harmful social consequences. People can get behind the wheel drunk, cause accidents. People can get into fights, squabbles, hurt themselves or other people, do things that are based on impaired judgment that they never would have done if they were sober when they're on alcohol. So he admits that it does have harmful social consequences and it is an addictive drug, but he says that it's not as addictive as heroin and cocaine. Now, he doesn't really give much explanation of that point. And I don't know if I can fully agree with him because, having, at least in my own life, known certain people with alcohol problems, when it gets to the worst stages of alcoholism, people can have full-on physical withdrawal symptoms. In some cases, they may need to actually have a medical detox so that they can safely, quit the alcohol without having their organs shut down or, passing out. It can produce some of the most powerful addictive effects on par with any of the other narcotic drugs. So, he says it's not as addictive, but I'm not sure if there's abundant scientific evidence to bear that claim out. But anyway, the clear objection to criminalization is that it would be hypocritical to criminalize drug use but not alcohol, especially since alcohol can even have greater social harm. But Wilson, in reaction again, says it's actually the legal access to alcohol that causes it to have such a great negative impact on society, and that if we legalize these same drugs that are being talked about, heroin, cocaine, etc., then we would probably increase their usage too, on par with what we already see with alcohol. Alcohol usage is pretty widespread in society because of its legal status. And he thinks that if we were to sort of try to have a consistent legal standard that says, well, if alcohol is legal, then the drugs should be too, then what we should expect as a result of that policy change would be more people becoming addicted to the non-alcoholic drugs, the other narcotic drugs, with all of the sort of same negative health and social impacts that would probably result in. So in his view, to be consistent, I mean, he probably would rather outlaw alcohol rather than legalize drugs to bring everything on par with one kind of legal status quo. Now, another point of opposition against him that he mentions briefly, some say that if the drugs were decriminalized, then at least people would use drugs openly, and because of that, they'd be more susceptible to point towards treatment centers. Because the way it is now, with drugs being illegal, there's a bit of a stigma or a social taboo against using them. So some of the people, or many of the people that use them, don't openly advertise that they do it. They'll post a picture of them drinking a beer on the weekend or whatever, but they won't let people see that they're actually also maybe doing cocaine or heroin or other things like that. Now, some argue that if drugs were legal, then there would be more social acceptability surrounding their use, and therefore people would be doing them more openly, which would also allow us to more easily identify the people that have drug habits, as opposed to how it is now, where many people with these habits carefully conceal it from public view because they don't want to be known as a drug user. So if it had the same status as alcohol, maybe it'd be easier to identify users and therefore more easily to direct them towards treatment. In reaction to that point, though, Wilson says, yeah, but you'd still have more addicts in total. And he then expresses skepticism as to whether treatment is really effective anyway. But I find that to be another piece of maybe tension within his overall argument. Because if you remember just a moment ago when we talked about the benefits of illegality, he said one of the benefits is precisely that courts can compel people into treatment centers, which is something good when the drugs are illegal. That would seem to express the view that these treatment centers actually have a positive effect on people that go into them and helps them. But now, when it's argued that decriminalization might help us identify people as subjects for treatment, he's casting skepticism or doubt on the, positive impact that might have on individuals or whether it even works. So I see that as something like where he's kind of in a way inconsistent a little bit. At one point in this article, he has said treatment is good, and when courts can push people into treatment, that's a good benefit of illegality. But then when he's faced with the objection that maybe decriminalization would allow people to more easily identify users and push them to treatment, he now says, who knows if treatment really works. Anyway, last couple of things. He says it's good for us to keep the drugs illegal in the bottom line so that existing addiction problems can be contained and so that we mitigate further expansion of the ranks of drug addicts. He also says it buys us time to learn more about the science of drug use and how it affects different centers within the brain, and maybe eventually to discover like medical or therapeutic treatments that can counteract that. We keep learning each year more and more about the brain and also how drugs affect dopamine receptor sites in the brain. And he says the extent to which scientists will be able to use those findings to control addiction will depend in part on the scope and scale of the problem that they face. So if we keep the problem on the margins through these anti-drug laws, then the chances of making a difference at a reasonable cost in the future, when there are more well-researched scientific interventions into addiction, then that would be better. The final thing he says at the very end is, what if I'm wrong? He admits that there's some bit of speculation in this. Perhaps if we legalize the drugs, we would see things opposite of what he's saying. Maybe fewer people would use them. Maybe fewer people would become addicted, or maybe it wouldn't have any large-scale socially negative effects that are, in excess of what we already see people with alcohol experiencing. In the end, he says no one can know 100% for sure what society would be like if we legalized all the drugs. But he says probably in his mind, it would result in increased usage, more addiction, greater number of accidents, and more violence and crime. But he says if he's wrong, then yeah, we're taking on needless costs. But if he's right and the legalization movement wins, then he thinks we'd be condemning millions of people to addiction and disease. And he thinks it would be unwise to take a chance on that just in the name of some kind of libertarian principle of radical individualism, and just given the comfort of suspicious or maybe perhaps false predictions. So that's James Q. Wilson. Now we've covered all the things he had to say. So we're moving on to the next author, kind of make a quick transition. So as you know, in a class like this, moral issues, it's always about balance. It's always about learning both sides of the debate, both sides of the argument. So when we studied, abortion, it was like, here's a pro-choice author, here's a pro-life author. Now we're on the drug policy topic, and we started off with James Wilson, who, as you know, is definitely anti-drug and one of the policy architects of that whole, war on drugs. But now here's another philosopher and writer named Douglas Husak. Okay, sorry, this marker's not amazing, so I'm going to get a better one for you, but I'll type it in the chat anyway. I thought I would just write it here so that I had it in the background. Douglas Husak is his name, and his paper is from 1992, and it's called A Moral Right to Use Drugs. So here we go. Moral Right to Use Drugs by Douglas Husak in 1992. So you can probably tell from his title that he's on the legalization advocacy side of this debate. He believes that actually, to the contrary of Wilson, we have a moral right to use drugs. He thinks that it's a violation of our rights to make drug use illegal. So he has a kind of twofold approach in the paper. The first part of the paper, he goes into a series of reasons as to why he thinks that just cost-benefit analysis would show that the costs of anti-drug laws are not outweighed by the benefits of those same laws. And that on the other hand, if legalization were to happen, he thinks that there would be benefits to society that would overweigh whatever costs that involves. So he does give a kind of utilitarian analysis at the beginning, where he's basically arguing that like net utility for all members of society would be increased under a legalization status quo as opposed to a criminalization status quo. So he kind of lines up all the sort of negative factors that are a consequence of the anti-drug laws, and he tries to show that these would not exist, of course, if drugs were legal. But then midway through the paper, he says, disregarding the cost-benefit analysis, if we just have a right to use these drugs, and most people who think about the concept of rights would say that rights take priority over utility. Suppose that there was a reasonable argument, well, it's not really reasonable, but suppose someone can make an argument that, like, if we instituted slavery against some class of human beings in our society, then we could get all this free labor, and that would be a great economic benefit for society. But even if you could argue that, it would violate the fundamental human rights of the people that were enslaved. And people who talk about rights usually say that rights take priority over utilitarian considerations. Like, so even if it would make a lot of people happy, or if even it would generate a lot of economic benefit or utility, it would simply be impermissible because it's standing in the way of people's rights. So he says that two things. First of all, he thinks that cost-benefit wise, it is a winning proposition to legalize the drugs. But he says even if you didn't agree with that, you'd have to concede that people have rights to do as they please as long as what they do doesn't interfere with other people. And that's why he thinks that you win on both sides, whether it's a utilitarian-minded argument or more deontological argument derived from the concept of rights. In either case, he thinks that legalization would be the better position. And in the end, he really leans heavily on this emphasis that we should have this right. And so it should be honored by the society and not prohibited. But anyway, let's get into his reasons. So he starts by saying that there is this perception in society that drug use is a problem that's out of control and maybe spiraling farther. We've seen that in the modern time too. The last few years, a lot of talk has been made out of drugs flowing across the border, and should we have really harsh anti-immigration policies to somehow interdict the flow of drugs from different places. Some people talk about the effect of opioid addiction on people and the kind of drugs that are being used to increase addiction rates there. This triggered a huge state response, this social perception that drug use is a major social problem. And because of that, drugs actually preoccupy our entire justice and legal system. We spend tens of billions of dollars each year to enforce laws against drugs, as was mentioned by even Wilson. Now, here are some statistics and figures that Husak offers to try and assist his argument and his conclusion. In 1992, when he wrote this paper, there were about 28 million drug users in the United States. Okay, so I just put that figure there, 28 million drug users in the United States in the year of 1992, and about 750,000 of them would be arrested each year. So, obviously not everyone using these drugs gets caught. Most people don't, but there's a significant quotient of them that do. And so that's around 750,000, or at least in the time period that he wrote this. Today, these figures would simply be inflated because we have a much larger total population size in 2025 than we had 33 years ago. But the facts that he attests to are generally still the same pattern we're seeing today. Now, what does that mean in terms of the expense to each citizen or to the society as a whole? Well, when 750,000 people are arrested for these drug laws, between 1/4 and 1/3 of those are considered felony offenses. Sorry, let me repeat. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of all felony offenses are drug related, and the severity of a sentence has no limits except for capital punishment. So it's theoretically possible for a person on some drug charge, if it was say major drug trafficking, to be in prison for life. But other than the death penalty, all penalties are at least theoretically available for some level of drug offense. So I'm going to repeat that. 28 million people that have been using drugs in the year that he wrote this, about 750,000 of them arrested each year. When you consider all felony offenses for any cause, whether it was assault and battery, murder, blah, 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 all felony offenses, between 25% and 33% of all of them are drug related. And again, the severity of a sentence has no limits except for straight up execution. What that ends up doing, as Husak points out, is that it kind of overcrowds our prison system and it clogs up the court system. Even here in California in the last decade, we had to slash the prison population by making kind of snap decisions about how to shorten people's sentencing because there were too many people there to house and to continue to support their incarceration. So it's like if we're going to have so many people incarcerated that we have to make random decisions later about how to like release them ahead of time, then you might argue that the laws themselves are too punitive or they're encompassing too many people in the dragnet of law. How much does each prisoner cost? Even in 1992, and inflation would have made this greater by now, but each prisoner cost between $10,000 and $40,000 per year to the Treasury. So each prisoner incarcerated for these drug offenses. Okay, because it's not as straightforward as like, okay, we arrest someone for a drug offense and we throw them into a hole and watch them starve or something and we don't spend any money. No, I mean, it's a society, and so people still have rights. They're still members of society, even if they've committed a crime. So, we have to house people in prison. We have to pay for their food and water and, their facilities there, their access to medical facilities, their court-appointed public counsel, if they can't afford one, which is often the case. And so depending on the nature of the individual, that's why there's a degree of variance there between 10K and 40K. I mean, some people have greater health complications, and you can't just say, well, you're in prison, so the fact that you have pneumonia, we're not going to do anything for you. We keep people alive in our prison system. This is still a first world country, so it costs money, basically. And with the average punishment for these various drug offenses being somewhere on the order of about 70 months, according to the textbook, which is, I guess, like a little over 5 years, each new inmate will cost the taxpayer an average of $110,000. And that's just one person. Now, that's a massive set of costs. That's something that feeds into the total cost of these anti-drug laws and enforcement efforts and incarceration efforts. So he's trying to point out that it's not for free. To have these anti-drug laws, we have to impose on ourselves as a society significant financial requirements. More than 3/4 of those that are arrested are being charged not with drug trafficking or sale, but simple possession and use. And the majority of those are actually charged with possession or use of marijuana rather than some of the more harsh narcotics that Wilson was talking a lot about. But he says the true extent of the war on drugs and the harm that it does is not simply known by just talking about the number of dollars that we spend or the people that we punish. It also has eroded our civil liberties. Because these anti-drug laws exist, think about it. An officer has the right to sort of search you if they have even a mild suspicion that you might be carrying something. So it puts us as subject to search and confiscation. We become evicted, search, have our licenses taken away, have our property seized, and we're denied federal loans in some cases too. That's something that a lot of you might have had to declare on your FAFSA applications. Like, I've never been convicted of any drug offense. So he asks, if all these costs, both financial and with respect to your rights and civil liberties, are a consequence of the anti-drug laws, then why do so many Americans use the drugs? It's actually a quite popular thing in the United States culture, the recreational drug use. And he says this is just an open question that's worthy of speculation or contemplation. He says it can't simply be the addictive power, because illegal drug use is actually less prevalent in other countries where the drugs are plentiful, cheap, and of even higher quality than they are here in the United States. So he just leaves that as an open question. I don't know what you think, but do you have any view as to what it might be about American culture that makes recreational illicit drug use such an attractive proposition for so many people? Any thoughts at all? I mean, as an observer of American culture, as a citizen within this culture, is there anything you notice or identify that might drive the appeal of illegal drugs? Because again, they're costly in terms of enforcement efforts, also on an individual level to those that use them. So why would it be that so many people are using them? He says you can't just say that it's because they're more powerful in our country, because in other countries, drug use is less prevalent, even when the drugs are easier to get, higher quality, and etc. So Tyler, you say pop culture portrays them in a cool light, movies, mental health. Okay, good. These are all great suggestions. I'll just try to add my thoughts on the same. I do think there is a pop culture issue with it. I mean, drug use is kind of glamorized in a lot of popular media, whether those are films, music, or in some cases, fashion. And we have a lot of notable celebrities that sometimes promote that kind of hedonistic lifestyle. So that's one aspect. We have Hollywood, we have the entertainment industry. So we're kind of like the global epicenter of like cool films, music, and set and artistry. So that's one thing that possibly could be an element. You talk about mental health, Jemin. Yes. So here's one thing. Americans, by comparison to other like Western nations, have longer hours, less vacation time. So this has to do with like the work ethic of Americans, which is a good thing. But at the same time, it kind of creates this kind of all or nothing mentality that some people have. Like, okay, well, I'm going to let loose on the weekend or after work because people don't have, let's say, enough spare time, free time, vacation time to simply have the balance that they need for work-life proportion. So sometimes people argue that the lack of time off can also contribute to people's desire to kind of be a little bit more wild and rowdy when they have the time to themselves. Mary Jane, you say, I think it is because there's so many different cultures and different cultural takes within the US that there is groupthink about drug usage, escapism. All these are great suggestions. The author doesn't try to answer the question himself. He just raises it as an open question. So I thought it might be a fun piece for us to have that little brief class chat, but we can keep moving. His next question is this: why has war been declared on drugs? In fact, he thinks that the whole metaphor and terminology of war on drugs is unhelpful in the extreme, and he finds that to be problematic. So he does not like the metaphor, the militaristic metaphor of war on drugs. Let me try and explain that point with some quick notes to you. So Husak dislikes the military metaphor of quote-unquote war on drugs. And I'll tell you a couple of reasons why he thinks that that's sort of a bad way to characterize it or frame it. First of all, if it was a war, you have to think in terms of like victory and defeat. And with a war, you have like your side and the enemy side. So if it's a war on drugs, what that does is it transforms your mentality into thinking about your fellow citizens, your neighbors, friends, family members that are having drug problems as like on par with enemies in a war. And the enemies in a war are not supposed to be negotiated with, they're not supposed to be cared for, they're supposed to be like eliminated. So he thinks that it kind of numbs our moral sensitivity to the people around us. We no longer seeing them as human beings, we're seeing them as kind of like these deviant criminals that have to be somehow eliminated from society. So the military metaphor has one negative effect. It makes us think of people that are using drugs as like enemies. So there's one point as to why he doesn't like this metaphor. It makes us think of people who are using drugs as quote unquote enemies, not to have any sympathy for them, but to have this kind of hard charging, militaristic stance against them. He also says that it's an inconsistent label, because if you wanted to address a major social problem by labeling it as a war that we're fighting against it, then where's the war on environmental degradation? Where's the war on poverty? Where's the war on, corporate profits that exclude the common person from being able to access services? So, he finds that we've kind of cherry picked and assigned the title of war to this perhaps social issue, but we're not doing it in a consistent way across the board. So why cast this big spotlight on that issue? So other social problems have not been declared the subject matter of a quote unquote war. So there's also the inconsistent application of the idea. And I like what you've said, Santino. It's kind of like the same idea with homeless people. Yeah, like these are not human beings, they're problems. They need to be like eradicated or somehow removed rather than, dealt with as human beings with sensitivity and care. He also says the metaphor of war limits how we approach the problem, because if it was war, then if somebody made an argument towards decriminalization, that would be like thought of or interpreted as surrender to the enemy. Like, let's wave the white flag and just give up on the war on drugs and lose. If it was a policy prescription, not talked about in war terms, then we could measure the effect of policy changes by seeing what the benefits or costs of those policy decisions were. But when you see it in terms of war, it's kind of black and white thinking. Like any movement towards concessions away from the status quo would be thus interpreted as like surrendering to an enemy. It also kind of calls to mind patriotic thoughts that might blind you to more rational thinking. Because with war, at least one person's perspective might be that, It's unpatriotic not to stand by your country when they're fighting a war. Are you siding with the enemy, et cetera, et cetera? So that kind of makes people a little more blind to the possibility that there could be some reasonable arguments given on the other side of this policy issue. So it also kind of limits our creativity and willingness to engage in more nuanced debates about how to change the status quo for the better. He also says that it's like a scapegoat that people will use. And it's an alternative to blaming people or the government. We could just blame drugs for all of our social problems. So he says it also, sorry, just getting this typed out. Drugs can be seen as a scapegoat, according to the war on drugs metaphor. Instead of blaming individuals for their own bad behavior or poor decisions, or society for not providing a more supportive system for others, we can just say drugs are the problem. And he mentions this, some people feel like America is in decline and they don't know who or what to blame. Like this mantra of the one political party, in power of making America great again. He even talked about how that was an idea that people expressed in the 80s and the early 90s. It's kind of a theme that we've seen over time. It's just kind of been rebranded again. But when people say things like, let's make it great again, one thing they're thinking about is, well, we're in decline and what's the reason? And some people will say that drugs are the reason for all of our problems. And they'll sometimes then associate that antagonism to the social decline that they perceive as also having a connection to foreigners. They think drug availability has to do with immigrants or foreigners pushing drugs into our system. So it can also lead to kind of antagonistic attitudes towards people that are not citizens or what have you. Now, maybe there is some truth that drug use could contribute to social decline, but Douglas Husak says that most drug use is actually not as negative as that, and it's conducted within responsible limits. Lots of other problems receive no media attention, and they haven't been made the target of a quote-unquote war. But anyway, he moves on and he says, having said all that, he says the larger point is still that we shouldn't even consider the drug issue from this kind of cost-benefit utilitarian perspective. And the reason is that prohibition of recreational drug use, he argues, violates our moral rights, regardless of the consequences, pro and con. He says at this point we should not confuse the term drug with illegal drug. His definition of drug is much similar to the one that we gave earlier when we introduced this topic: any substance that can affect bodily functions and structures. So really what's been going on with the war on drugs is not war on drugs per se, but war on specific class of recreational drugs. So war has been declared on people who make recreational use of drugs. And what is recreational drug use, to even be more clear about it? Recreational drug use is drug use that's done for a specific reason. It's consumption of drugs that's intended to promote pleasure of the user. So when people talk about a war on drugs, it's really a war on that specific type of drug using behavior, recreational. Recreational meaning it's done for fun, for pleasure. There's, of course, non-recreational drug use, which could be either medical or ceremonial, like in certain kind of religious traditions. There's certain drugs used in, like indigenous cultures. Of course, some people will take drugs for the purposes of committing suicide, and that's not recreational use. There can also be performance-enhancing drugs that are not done to enhance the person's pleasurable feelings, but rather to make them better performers at whatever sport. Of course, that's mostly prohibited by sports systems and the sporting world. But yeah, just by contrast, there could be non-recreational drug use. But it's the recreational use that's intended to promote the pleasure of the user that seems to be the target of all this heavy anti-drug law and policy discussion. And why would people use drugs for recreational purposes? Well, because in some cases, people might argue that it could enhance an already enjoyable event. People will sometimes use drugs before they go to a concert or watch a movie or et cetera, because the event's already fun in some ways, but then the drug use could arguably enhance the pleasurable experience. In other cases, people will use them when there's nothing else going on and it's just to alleviate boredom. So in that case, it's the drug itself that becomes the event and the pleasurable source of recreation. Now, he believes that even though there are some drug users that behave badly, that it would be wrong to apply a harsh zero-tolerance policy to all of them based on the perceived problems of just a few.
this might remind you a little bit of arguments that Second Amendment defenders give when it comes to curtailing gun rights. So let's see if you can follow the logic here, because Husak's bringing up a point that you'd often hear defenders of Second Amendment making when calls come out to, let's say, more heavily restrict access to private ownership of guns. The Second Amendment defender will sometimes say, like after a mass shooting or a big public violent act like that, well, why should we restrict law-abiding citizens' responsible gun ownership just because of the perceived problems of like a few marginal cases of like these maniac people that are outliers? These are exceptions, not the rule. If the vast majority of gun owners own their guns with responsibility and don't commit acts of violence, then why should we impose restrictions heavily on them just because of the bad behavior of their deviant counterparts that are really marginal cases and not the mainstream of cases? In the same way, Husak argues that you can make a parallel argument with regard to the recreational drug user. The recreational drug user in the typical case is not like some drug addicted dropout from society committing crimes like a total fiend. For the most part, people that use these recreational drugs actually do have a manner in which they can sort of balance that with the other obligations and responsibilities that they have in life. So he says, as the Second Amendment defender might say, why should we place such heavy restrictions on general recreational drug use when it's really only the perceived problems of the most extreme addicts that are getting all the attention? I hope I make sense when I'm saying that, but that's something that he mentioned in passing in his article. So he next talks about the decriminalization movement. And he returns to the point that our courts and jail system is clogged by the overabundance of, prosecution efforts for anti-drug laws. It also seems that there's an unfair, perhaps racial bias in the implementation of the penalties across different cases. This is something that, it really can't be totally ignored, and I'm sure that you have a sense of it in your own life today. But he gives us real statistical data. So 2/3 of the drug users, here's a little factoid, so I'll put it in the chat. So it says there that 2/3 of drug users in the state of New York in 1987 were white. And that shouldn't be a shock to anybody, because if you just look at the total statistical incidence of different demographics in our country, about 70% of all the people in the United States are white. So you would expect that if 70% of the people are white, that about 70% of the drug users would be white too, because it's just the majority of people, so there's more white people in total. Kitties, hey! Sorry, my cats, they sometimes tussle, and I'm hearing them scream while they're shooting me 1 second. Hey! Go fighting, guys. Come on, back it up, back it up. Yeah, it's just those home lectures, right? Yeah, they're fine. They're totally fine. Not to worry. It's just Peachy sometimes. She really, she wants me to know that I'm supposed to break it up. So that's what happens. No issues. They really are. They're gentle. They don't fight like for real. But anyways, coming back to the point, I was telling you that about 2/3 of the drug users in the United States in not in the United States, in the state of New York in 1987 were white, and I was just telling you that tracks with the overall demographics in terms of the statistical proportion of white people in our country. So that's a majority, right? But I don't know if it's a shock to you to learn that 91% of convicted persons in that same state in that year were either Black or Hispanic. So here we're putting that in the chat. Just gotta type it right, okay. So if you have 2/3 of the people that are using drugs white, but over 90% of the people facing penalties legally that are, minorities, it tells you that maybe there's a little bit of a greater profiling or a greater, emphasis on focusing on the habits and behaviors of those people that are in the minority category. So like in a perfectly fair world, if there's 2/3 of people that are using drugs that are white, 2/3 of the people absorbing the penalties would also be white. But it shows here that like the 1/3 quotient of those that are not white are absorbing like the lion's share of the penalties under the law. So it shows you that enforcement efforts are not exactly being done in a totally equitable way. And this is a further reason that the author Husak offers as to why we should be skeptical of the wisdom of these intense anti-drug laws, because when you empower society to remove people's liberty and incarcerate them, imprison them because of their drug-using behavior, wouldn't you like to have a little bit better assurance that the way in which the laws are then enforced are going to not exhibit racial bias, profiling, or some kind of statistical aberration like what you see here? So there sometimes are diversion options, like we talked about earlier, people being placed into diversion programs by court order so that they can expunge their record from a minor drug offense. But those diversion options are more often given to people with greater legal representation and better lawyers, so they're often more available for people that are middle and upper class users, which again is going to track more socioeconomically with people that have greater access to wealth. Generally speaking, that's also going to be people that are like less often minorities in our society. So he thinks the war on drugs is bad for that reason too, that we have sort of given license to the state to enforce the rules, and sometimes they end up doing that in ways that don't necessarily reflect like perfectly equitable imposition of penalties. The war on drugs is also bad, he thinks, because it makes criminals into people that otherwise would have been lawful citizens. So there's millions of people that, you know, they've committed no other crime besides their drug offense, and then they're put into the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of recidivism once you're entered into the into the criminal justice system, say for like a drug offense. It's likelier that that's going to have like snowball effects on your future prospects for employment and independence, thus maybe making it even likelier that you'll fall into a pattern of criminal behavior furthermore from there. As he says, I'll read this from page 237. He has a little discussion in the text on the point. Saying here, finally and most significantly, the war on drugs is counterproductive in making criminals of tens of millions of Americans whose behavior is otherwise lawful. Most drug users are lucky to escape detection. Others are less fortunate. Countless numbers of offenders have been forced to suffer long terms of imprisonment for violating laws that may not be morally justified. Even those who are eventually acquitted spend tremendous sums of time and money defending themselves in court. And on the previous point, since I'm looking at the text now, just reading it, among the more serious effects of prohibition is discrimination against the poor, who increasingly consume a higher and higher percentage of illegal drugs. Although 2/3 of weekly drug users in New York State in 1987 were white, 91% of the persons convicted and sentenced to prison for drug-related offenses were either Black or Hispanic. So when you look at the total outcome of the anti-drug laws, he says you have to weigh on the scales of benefit and cost, you know, what we get in terms of the results of these laws. So suppose that a person, if the drugs were criminalized, might have not used them as much, but when they are criminalized, they now face this kind of incarceration. What's worse for a person, the drug use that they could have legally accessed had not the laws existed, or the incarceration that they would then suffer if the laws do exist? You could argue that the greater harm is actually the incarceration and exposure to the criminal justice system itself. So if you had to choose, what would you rather have? A person suffer through the negative effects of drug addiction, or a person suffering through the negative effects of incarceration and social exclusion that comes from being labeled a criminal? If it was purely based on cost benefit, here again, it's at least equivocal as to whether that would really be the better outcome or the better alternative. Now, he says, let's consider some arguments that defend criminalization and see if they can be refuted. One thing he mentions in that piece of the essay is that normally anyone who wants to criminalize something will have a high burden of proof that they have to argue in favor beyond, because there's always a presumption of freedom. You know, if someone said, we're going to make something criminal, you'd be like, well, is it absolutely necessary to criminalize it? Because unless it's going to be harmful, people generally regard their autonomy and freedom as important. But against that, there's a balanced out presumption of the status quo. So that's all he really says about the burden of who has more of a burden of argument, and then he kind of moves on. He assumes that any defense of criminalization must demonstrate that it's needed to prevent real harm to other people. Because I think we all recognize and agree, at least with the harm principle of criminalization. No one would say that I have every right to harm others. So if drug using behavior was harmful to others, it could be reasonably argued as something that's legitimately criminalized. More controversially, you might say that it's a good thing because the conduct can harm the user themselves. But he worries about, you know, the sort of negative implications of accepting the paternalistic principle of criminalization, because again, it seems like it's the government running your life for you or acting like your parent, when after all, you should be, as a rational adult, better equipped to make decisions about what's in your own self-interest. So his view is that criminal sanctions should require harm. He also discounts the legal moralist principle of criminalization. He says, no, It's not legitimate to prohibit immoral conduct, whether it's harmful or not, just on that sole basis that it's immoral. Legal moralism, he says, is a weak principle. First of all, why? Because it says that one view of morality should be enshrined in law at the exclusion of other alternatives. At least the harm principle, he says, of criminalization would ensure that there's a victim in a criminal act. But the legal moralism principle wouldn't even necessarily require that. It would just require that we label the conduct immoral and then say that that's a sufficient basis to criminalize it. But he now wants to drill down on that a little bit. Like, why would anyone think that drug use is immoral, setting aside the issue of harm that it might cause? If it wasn't clearly established as being harmful to any other person, then what could be immoral about it? It can't be the fact that it, diminishes somebody's health or maybe intellectual capacities, because alcohol can do that as well, and we don't criminalize it. So his view is that the reason that the legal moralist says that drug use is immoral is because of the fact that it alters our consciousness. But again, the question could be repeated. What's wrong with the alteration of consciousness? So let me put some of this here in the chat. Husak wonders why a legal moralist So he asked this question that I've typed in the chat. He wonders, why would a legal moralist, again, that's a person who accepts the legal moralism principle of criminalization, that it doesn't even require harm. It just has to be immoral in some sense to be specified for something to be legitimately prohibited under the law. But he's asking that question of the legal moralist. Why would they think that drug use is immoral if it actually didn't at least be established to clearly cause harm to other people? And his answer to that is, it seems to him that this is considered immoral because it alters one's consciousness. Sorry, one little typo, fixing that. Yeah, so his thought as to why those would make the case that it's immoral is because it has to do with the alteration of consciousness. But again, we could ask the question, what's wrong with the alteration of consciousness? Why is it immoral? For example, other activities that do alter one's consciousness are not thought to be presumptively immoral on that basis alone. Take the case of somebody that engages in transcendental meditation, okay? Like if you engage in transcendental meditation, sometimes people say that it can result in like a feeling of loss of identity, that your individualism gets blurred into the background of reality and you feel like you're somehow joined with the bigger cosmic picture of things. Alcohol, of course, can also result in an alteration of consciousness. Sometimes people that run a lot, like even me, can feel the example of runner's high, so at the extremes of like athletic effort or competition, sometimes you'll get that kind of buzzy feeling that comes from like all these endorphins that are being released in the body and brain. But people don't say, hey, stop that running, or stop that meditation. Or, I mean, some people advise not to drink alcohol, but they don't criminalize it, at least since Prohibition, they haven't done that. So in his mind, anyway, the moral objections resulting in surrounding the idea of alteration of consciousness come back to a certain root cause. He thinks that lurking in the background of those ideas is a Christian conception of virtue. So he says it is a Christian idea of morality or virtue that leads people to think the alteration of consciousness is wrong. Well, let me explain why he thinks this, okay? The Christian conception of virtue says that the proper moral character we should have is one that is altruistic, that is serving other people. The example of Jesus Christ, is obviously central to the Christian tradition. And when you think of his most significant action, it's like dying for everyone's sins, right? So he sacrifices to the point of death for other people to be benefited. And it seems to run contrary to this Christian conception of virtuous behavior to like engage in self-indulgent, non-altruistic recreational behavior. You know, like it doesn't say in the Bible, like, go down into your basement and just like, you know, take a bunch of drugs and play video games for fun. You know, it's always something like, you know, aspire to serve your neighbor and love your brother and like, you know, erect this kind of Christian virtue society that's based on not just self-indulgent, non-altruistic behavior. So he thinks that because we have this kind of Judeo-Christian like set of ethical and legal principles that the country was sort of founded on, that's bleeding through into these anti-drug laws. Even if it's not explicitly stated as such, he thinks that that's kind of the moral impulse that leads towards the construction of this legal architecture. So he says, you know, it's a Christian conception of virtue that's kind of lurking in the background of this principle that it's immoral to try and alter your consciousness for fun, for pleasure. And I'm reading on page 238 and 9 where he says that. He says, moral objections to drug use might be derived from a certain idea of human excellence. Drug use might not be conducive to the attainment of a particular concept of virtue. These arguments are frequently endorsed by drug prohibitionists. He quotes James Wilson, who says that drugs alter one's soul. What concept of virtue is being employed here? The Christian tradition, for example, identifies virtue with the personal imitation of Christ, emphasizing extraordinary sacrifice in the service of others. According to this tradition, drug use, like any other recreational activity, is suspicious. Recreational activities are non-altruistic and self-indulgent, but he gives an obvious rejoinder to that point, which is that it's not the business of the criminal law to try and stand up some particular conception of moral virtue. It's rather more minimally intended to prevent us from causing harm to others or from interfering with other people's property rights. So in his mind, the legal moralism principle is weak on numerous grounds. First of all, why consider this act immoral, or at least any more immoral than other like pleasure-seeking recreational behavior is? And if there's a general problem with recreational pleasure-seeking behavior, what's the problem? Why? Maybe it has to do with the Christian conception of virtue. But in a pluralistic society, the law shouldn't put its thumb on the scale and play favorites as to like one conception of virtue over another. As long as what you're doing isn't hurting anyone else, he would think that's the only obligation that the legal system should really have to bear. Finally, at the end, he wants to clarify his view. He concludes in the end that arguments in favor of adults having a moral right to recreational drug use are better than the arguments from the other side. But at the very end, he says, I don't want to be misunderstood or misconstrued as a person that's advocating for drug use. He makes a sort of a nuanced point at the end, which is that having the right to do something is not the same thing as encouraging people to do that same thing. So let me write this in the chat. Maybe I'll have to wrap this last point up a little bit at the beginning on Thursday, but we're pretty much all done with this Husak. He says here, last word, saying that okay, so what I typed in is what he said. Arguing or making the case that people should have a right to do something X is not the same as encouraging people to do the thing X, okay? I don't want to rush that point through. So if you don't mind, someone will probably remind me, or I'll remember anyway, to open up with this last little bullet at the beginning on Thursday, and then we'll be almost done with our drug lectures. I believe we have at least one more, which is the article about paternalism by Gerald Dworkin, which is another kind of moderate, maybe moderate anti-drug author, but he really talks more broadly about paternalism itself, which is an interesting topic, not just in the drug context, but in a more broad sense. So we'll cover that on Thursday. Also, please don't forget that your first essay is due Thursday, anytime before 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Thursday. You just have to email it to me. I don't have like a module or some submission thing on Canvas. So just email it to me, rvulich@fullerton.edu. You'll see that in the syllabus. It's easy to find my email information. Email it, or you can send it through Canvas inbox if you'd rather, but just make sure that it's properly attached as a PDF or a document file, and I'll confirm that I received it before we get to the end. Marina, you say, would we be able to make a Kantian argument that it's still immoral since we lose rational autonomy? I like your question. Let me think about that. I mean, some might argue that it compromises autonomy. Others would maybe say that your autonomy is vindicated by the ability to make free decisions about whether you want to use these drugs. But I think a typical Kantian would also have this issue of whether you're using yourself as a means to an end by engaging in pleasure-seeking behavior that could somehow compromise your intellectual or physical capacities. So it's not undisputed as to how a Kantian could respond to the whole drug policy debate. But many of them, I think, would probably lean more heavily on an anti-drug position because they could, in two different ways, make the case that it's using oneself as a means or that it's compromising your rational autonomy. Other people, though, make the argument that autonomy is coextensive with being able to make decisions as an adult as to whether you want to use the drugs. So there is some Kantian debate within the realm of Kantian scholars, but I think that you sort of see the general lay of the land there. Okay, so Santino and everybody else, I want to say thanks, guys. I know we're at the end, so please feel free to sign out, say goodbye, whatever. Appreciate all your guys' contribution and participation again. Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Sorry, my cats, got me a little bit distracted for just 1 second, but don't worry about them. They're always really cute and peaceful, but they just sometimes play rough once in a while. Probably because I'm not paying attention to them on the doing the lecture, so they just want to get my attention. Thanks, everybody. Okay, take care, and we'll see you guys next time. All right. Thank you, and have a good day.